Back up in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Brother Wayne and I swapped on Wednesday night, so that's why we're talking about 1 Samuel 17 tonight, or this morning. So we left off last time sort of right in the middle of David's battle with Goliath. And we know that David was a man who did not lack in courage. We definitely can say that based on his words. Unlike the other Israelites who, at this point, have been afraid of Goliath, even the king Saul, who was supposed to be the captain or the protector of his people, was so steeped in fear, he wasn't even willing to act as well, just like the other Israelites. So David has the courage. He goes and he encounters Goliath. That's sort of right there where we left off. And we sort of ended again by talking about David's speech, right? When it came to victory, David's confidence was in the Lord. You see that over and over again in his speech. Verse 46, "This day will the Lord deliver Goliath into my hand." And, you know, he uses the pronoun I a lot, but he connects his actions with what God's will is. And David was a man that God has already made that declaration about David back in 1 Samuel chapter 16, about when Samuel went to go and find the next king of Israel to replace Saul. In 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, God simply noted about David, he was looking at somebody on the inside. The Lord was looking, he was judging based on the character of the person's heart. And so David was a man that was confident because he knew what God's will is. And so he attributes his actions to God being connected within that. Verse 47, David simply notes again that God at this point is going to save Israel. All right, so verse 48, "It came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army of the Philistine." So we've mentioned this before, but what you have here that's indicated to us is what's being contrasted is David's speed versus Goliath's slowness. And this is a verse where this comes out once again. You know that, again, the Philistine's just a reference to Goliath. The Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David. But you note David's actions, that David hasted. If you've got another translation, what is the word that is translated there? Or what's another word for hasted? Hurried, right? David hurried. He ran. You almost picture the image of somebody who's very large. He's got all that armor on. He's very strong, but he's pretty slow at being able to move. I'm not sure if you've ever watched, you see this sort of, maybe this scene play out in some times. I think about one of the Rocky movies. One of the opponents that Rocky had to face was really big and strong, but one of the ways that Rocky beat him was because he was faster. And this is sort of the same idea that's pictured here. We're told that one of the battles between the Greeks and the Persians that had occurred probably about 500 years after this. One of the reasons why the Greek Navy, who was very small and was not nearly as powerful and as large as the Persian Navy was, one of the reasons why they beat them is because they could outmaneuver them. They were faster. This is a case where David simply outmaneuvers, or he's a lot quicker in his actions than what Goliath is. Now, you know verse 48, what does it say here about Goliath's position? There's a pretty interesting word here that describes Goliath's position. It's the first verb there in verse 48. It said that Goliath arose. Now, one of the things that is looked at in this passage, and this word does indicate the idea of literally getting up. And so one of the things that Goliath perhaps has done at this point. After he has made his speech, basically in verse 44, some seem to think, based on verse 48 indicating that Goliath arose, that after Goliath got through speaking, he actually sat down once he stopped speaking and he allowed David to speak. That would have been a sign of disrespect. It would have been a sign of really taking David lightly. And we've talked about Goliath's speech before, that Goliath felt disrespected by David coming to him. But there is a potential, here that Goliath was actually sitting down when David made this speech. You also, we'll talk about that in a moment when we get down in the next couple of verses. So think about that for a minute. Just ponder over that for a minute. Verse 49, David put his hand in his bag and took a stone and slang it and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead and he fell upon his face to the earth. So we not this past Wednesday, but the Wednesday before that, you remember we watched a video of how a sling is demonstrated. And that particular example showed the amount of damage the amount of damage that a stone from a sling could cause on the human body. If you remember how great that damage was, right? He took the sling, put the stone in it, and threw it. And that I'm not exactly sure what that target was made out of, but it was to resemble the human torso. But it went straight through the head. So this is a very powerful weapon. I'd watched some videos about this of how some people have depicted David and Goliath, and there were a couple of movies or videos on it that when they show David killing Goliath in verse 49, it almost shows the stone, or it shows the stone being slung and it hitting Goliath in the head and it just bouncing off and leaving a really bad mark on Goliath's head. But that's not what's indicated here, right? Verse 49 says that David took the stone, slung it, and that it sunk into his forehead. Now, if you remember that video we watched, it's very much true that could happen, right? That the stone could sink into his forehead. But a lot of people, when they depict this, it's almost like it hits him in the head, bounces off, and it sort of knocks him unconscious, and then it ultimately kills him. But the indication here is that it goes into the head. It sinks in. It breaks through the skin, through the bone. And so Goliath fell and was dead. So one thing that you note about verse 49, a point of application here, Goliath had all the armor that man could buy. When it came to being well protected, there was probably not an individual that had the quality, the same type of armor in the Philistine army that Goliath had. But all that armor that Goliath had could not protect him in this particular situation. You think about how a lot of people, when it comes to dealing with uncertainty in life, I think none of us like to deal with uncertainty, right? I think we all like to have things certain. We like to know everything that's going on. We like to be prepared for whatever may happen. For some people, when it comes to being certain for protection, some people take upon it themselves to build their armor, so to speak, based on what the world has to provide, right? Some people think that, and we might have mentioned this before, having a strong bank account, having a large bank account, having a lot of money, that can be the breastplate, right, that protects us from any type of economic uncertainty that comes in life. Sometimes we think about having a good, stable job. That's important, but some people think that, well, as long as I continue to have that, I've got the necessary protection to make it through life. Some people would think to themselves, as long as I have a way of entertainment to get my mind distracted from the things that maybe cause me to be afraid or uncertain in life, well, that's good enough armor to put on that I don't have to worry about being affected by those things. There are people that not necessarily immoral people, but people that maybe have the best intentions in the world that think like that, right? Take the things of the world that aren't bad and use that to be the armor that I don't have to worry about, that'll protect me whenever hard times or even temptation, spiritual issues arise. And there's some people that essentially have their armor on based on the things of the world. But that's not ultimately what can protect you, right? David didn't have a shred of armor on, and yet it's David who is the one that stands victorious rather than Goliath, because David's trust and confidence was in God. So that's something for us potentially to think about if we think about the application here. But verse 50, David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. So verse 50, sort of in a way, is just a summation of what has just happened. Now, what is the importance, verse 50, there at the end, that there was no sword found in the hand of David? Why is that important to mention? Okay, so yeah, later he would use his, David would later use, I believe, Goliath's sword. There's something else here that's also significant about why there's no sword there in the hand of David.
He did this without a sword. Defeated him without a
sword. Yeah, he defeated him without a sword. What did David say just a minute ago to what did David just say a minute ago to Goliath? Think back verse 47.
The Lord saves not with sword and spear.
Right, the Lord saves not with sword and spear. So David, in this particular instance, is what's being noted here? What's the author noting here about David's victory? Yeah, it came by the Lord. It was God's victory here. David had just made the proclamation that all this assembly shall know that verse 47, all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. David was essentially, when he went to Saul tried to build him up, give him the armor, give him the weaponry that he was going to fight like Goliath. Well, that's not what David had done. David did not need a sword to defeat Goliath. So what's being attributed here, the importance of that phrase is, it's another reminder that this is not, it's not like David got lucky in this instance. It's the idea that God gave David the victory. Didn't need a sword in his hand.
David had faith too.
Yeah, absolutely. David had ultimate faith, right? There are a lot of people that when they saw Goliath, they wanted to be as well protected. They probably would have tried to be more well protected than Goliath. I think about an example. I think about getting in a ring with a boxer, right? I have no experience boxing or fighting or anything like that. And if you put me in a ring with a boxer, I want a lot of protection on me, right? Because I'm not I'm not going to be able to throw some very effective punches per se. But generally in a situation, you would want to be as well protected as not, but David's faith was in God. That was his protection, and that's, again, what had delivered him the victory. We could also tie in verse 50, the fact that there is no sword in the hand of David. Again, we've mentioned that the Philistines, they were known for their weaponry, they were known for their metal production. That's also important as well. Because if you looked at this physically, the Philistines had a lot better armor and a lot better weapons than what the Israelites and what David would have had. But the importance is that God gave David the victory. What's being noted there. All right, so with that being said, are there any comments on those three verses before we look at sort of the last section of chapter 17?
I wonder if Goliath had ever had anybody run to him to fight. Verse 48, David ran toward him. I just wonder sure that didn't make him any less afraid of David, or not afraid of David, but nonetheless, maybe caught him off guard a little bit. Here's somebody actually who wants to fight.
True. And you think about what we talked about last time. Verse 43. What did Goliath note about what David had in his possession in verse 43? Yeah, it just said that verse 43, the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves or sticks? Referencing the shepherd's staff that he would have had. Again, Goliath, and at least in that verse, didn't note that David had a sling and a stone in his possession. So perhaps he was also caught by surprise. When he drew up, he arose to meet David, and you could almost picture, David pulls a secret weapon out where Goliath had not seen it. Nevertheless, perhaps Goliath had never had somebody challenge him like that. Either way, Goliath at this point is dead. All right, so verse 51. Verse 51, 52, or let's go ahead and read 51 down through verse 53. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines until thou come to the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sharam, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they spoiled their tents. All right, so verse 51, what were the conditions upon victory for the Israelites and the Philistines that Goliath had set out?
Whoever lost would serve. Whoever lost would have to serve.
Right, so the conditions that were given by Goliath, and if we go back and look, that is toward the beginning of the chapter, 1 Samuel 17, verse 9. Probably want to mark that in conjunction with verse 51, because the conditions of the battle here was that at this point, now that Goliath is dead, the Philistines were supposed to turn themselves over to be servants for the Israelites. But that's not what happens. The Philistines, they saw their champion was dead, they fled. Again, this is being done in front of both armies, right? We've talked about this before, but the encounter between David and Goliath would have been, you have the armies standing on opposing sides, and David and Goliath sort of meet in the middle. And so the outcome is known to everybody. But you know that David goes, again, you see David's quick action, right? David ran. It doesn't say that he walked or that he limped, right? It said that he ran, noting his speed. And then he goes and he cuts the head off of Goliath. Now, I don't know about you, but that's something that would be pretty. I couldn't be able to do that. I think probably anybody in here couldn't be able to do that. But there is a little bit of significance why David goes and does that, as we'll note in a moment. But you know what David has done, though? He's not only made the Philistines afraid by what has happened, but what has he done to the Israelites? Gave them courage. The Israelites arose, they shouted. That's generally in a military setting. That's you think about a war cry. That's something that denotes confidence. They pursued the Philistines. Now you know where they pursued them to. The valley to the gates of Ekron. The wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sharam, even unto Gath and unto Ekron. These were some of the main cities of the Philistines. And so the picture here is not that the Israelites just won on this battlefield, but the indication is that they kept chasing them all the way back to the land of the Philistines. The Israelites at this point, because of what David has done, we might could say that they have achieved total victory. So by verse 53, once the children of Israel return, they get to take of the possessions of the Philistines. As it says there, they spoiled their tents or plundered their tents. Now, you think about this point, you think about you think about this particular point, you can think about some points of application connected to it. Again, you think about how much one man's actions mattered, right? Sometimes we think about to ourselves that, we may get in the thought process that, my actions don't necessarily matter as much because I'm only one individual. And sometimes we use that to get out of doing some things that we should. Maybe we use that as a way. Sometimes maybe we use that as a means where we're ultimately putting ourselves down where we shouldn't. But what David shows to us is that one man's actions matter. Had David not acted, do you think he would have seen the Israelites have the courage to go and attack the Philistines, to drive them back to where they came from? Well, no, right? If David had not acted, the Israelites would never have had the courage. That was the results of one man's actions. And so we think about that for us as Christians when it comes to, being the type of example that the Bible commands us to be. Sometimes we think that if we're the only Christian in the place where we go to school or the place where we work, it probably feels like a lot of times that our actions do not matter, that one person's actions don't have that good of effect. But you never know, right? Sometimes one person's actions can have a great amount of effect on people. We as Christians, sometimes we may lose sight of that, but we can never forget that as Jesus commanded in Matthew chapter 5 about letting our light shine, you never know, right? You never know what type of impact, what type of emphasis, what type of example you're setting behind that'll motivate people to, either be obedient to the cross or maybe people that are willing to start acting more like Christians. And that can be the legacy of just one individual and his actions. That's what David shows to us. The actions of one individual matters. For the Israelites, that gave them great and tremendous courage. All right, so verse 54, David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So when David went and killed Goliath and cut his head off, it wasn't just an act of anger on the part of David. It's not because David sort of enjoyed doing this. The thought behind verse 54 is that generally in times of battle like this was sort of seen as a sign. This was like a trophy, taking a trophy from battle. And even as gruesome as this is to think about, it was just a common thing during that time, during warfare, to the main, at least in this case, the main champion, to go and to do this and to turn him into a trophy. We've mentioned before when the Philistines had defeated the Israelites back in 1 Samuel chapter 4, what did they take home as a trophy back to the house of Dagon? The initials are AOC. Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant, right? Back in 1 Samuel 4, the Philistines had taken back the Ark of the Covenant as a trophy or as a memorial of that victory. Here, that's pretty interesting to note too here, right? David doesn't take the Philistines' gods back as a trophy of victory. Why do you think that was the case? Yeah, it doesn't have any value, right? There was no value in idolatry. David wasn't, David wasn't going to return that way. There was some significance in taking, obviously, Goliath's head back. That David takes his armor and puts it in his tent. So part of that victory was to go to all Israel, and David got to keep some for his personal efforts. But I think that is interesting to note, though, back in 1 Samuel 4, the Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant as their trophy, but David and the Israelites aren't concerned about the idols of the Philistines, taking that as a spoil of war. All right, so verse 55 through 58. A little bit interesting, few verses here. When Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said unto Abner, the captain of the host, Whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As thy soul liveth, O king, I cannot tell. And the king said, Inquire thou whose son the stripling is. And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son art thou, thou young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. All right, so verse 55, we almost have pictured here that, we just talked about the immediate setting where we're right there watching David kill Goliath. It's almost like we're seeing another window of the same scene where we're looking at it from where Saul and Abner are viewing this. And as David goes to approach Goliath, this is when Saul asks these questions to Abner. All right, so the first question, right, whose son is this youth? Now, that is kind of interesting to us because we know at this point David has already met Saul, right? 1 Samuel 16, David first went into the service of Saul, being the armor bearer, playing music for him. They've already obviously met 1 Samuel 17:32, and right before David had met Goliath. So it might be interesting for us, it might just be interesting to think about why is Saul asking, whose son is this thy youth? Or whose son is this youth? And Abner doesn't know. The point being is that while Saul probably knew David somewhat because of his service. Probably at this point, Saul didn't know David quite that well. Might have known who he was, might not have known much about his family. And that's where Saul is asking this question. If you think about that particular case, we probably don't think about how many servants, how many people worked under the king Saul, right? If you think about the president, right? Is the president probably going to know all of the interns that are working in Congress, right? Not the senators, not the House of Representatives, but the interns that work for the senators and the representatives. Do you think the president's going to know everything about those individuals? No, probably not. Think about it in that way. Saul's obviously benefited from the work. Saul knows David to a degree, but Saul's going to have a lot of servants. So knowing David a lot more, knowing about his family, probably something Saul had not been in the position to know at this point. All right, so Abner is to go out to find out whose son the stripling is. Perhaps the usage of the word stripling here is in connection with David's appearance compared to Goliath, because verse 55, Saul is making this request of Abner as David has just encountered Goliath. So David goes with Abner, brings with him the head of Goliath in his hand, and that connects back to verse 54, I assume, or at least later on it will, as a trophy. So verse 58, again, Saul said to him, Whose son art thou, young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. So in a particular situation like this, one thing that would have benefited not just David, but David's family would have been benefited, right? We remember what the men had said back in 1 Samuel 17 when David had first approached his brothers. 1 Samuel 17, verse 25, when the men of Israel are talking about Goliath, Have you seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give the daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. Perhaps Saul might have wanted to know about David's family, because if David came from a poor background, David might have had parents that he might have come from a slave's home. And so perhaps Saul might have wanted to, in order to thank David, as what verse 25 would indicate, perhaps Saul would want to free David's household. But the importance, that's a possibility, at least in Saul's mind. We know that David was not in that position, but David's actions not only brought about him personal blessing, personal success, but it also brought about good things for his family. And that's where we'll leave off, and that's a good point of application too as we draw to a close, because I'll need to set up the live stream thing in a minute. But verse 58 again, sometimes when I do the right thing, I'm not only benefited by that, but everybody else around me a lot of times is benefited by that. You know, if you certainly think about that in the situation of being in the home, right? If I'm doing what I should as a Christian father, well, that's not only going to benefit me as a Christian, but that's also going to spiritually benefit my wife. It would spiritually benefit my kids, and anyone that is connected to me. David, because of his great faith, because he does the right thing, he's not only going to benefit himself, but he's also going to benefit those that are closest to him for doing the right thing. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and stop here. We'll pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 18 on Wednesday. But thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention.